Today we examine a case from the mid-19th century. How did a man who swore an oath to heal become one of the most prolific killers of Victorian England? Our journey takes us to the market town of Rugeley in Staffordshire. Behind its respectable Georgian houses and busy coaching inns, a series of deaths would expose a man whose weapon of choice was not a knife or a gun, but medical knowledge itself. William Palmer was born on August 6, 1824. He was the sixth of 8 children born to Sarah and Joseph Palmer. His father ran a successful timber business, and the family lived comfortably among the town's respectable middle class. When William turned 12, his father died, leaving behind an estate worth £70,000. In today's money, that would be over £8.5 million. The family was set for life. With such wealth behind him, young William had every advantage. He pursued medicine, and his education was impeccable. He trained at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, an institution founded in 1123 and still one of Britain's most prestigious medical establishments. In 1846, at just 22 years old, he qualified as a physician through the Royal College of Surgeons of England, an organization with roots stretching back to the 14th century. On paper, William Palmer was the model of Victorian success. Educated, wealthy, respectable. But there were cracks in the facade. At 17, he had taken an apprenticeship at a chemical laboratory in Liverpool. Within 3 months, he was dismissed for stealing money. It was a small incident, easily overlooked by a forgiving family with deep pockets. But it hinted at something darker beneath the surface. After qualifying as a physician, Palmer returned to Rugeley, but he showed little interest in building a proper medical practice. He treated a few family members, but mostly he indulged in the lifestyle of a young gentleman about town. He had developed a reputation during his student years in London as a womanizer and gambler, and he had no intention of abandoning those pleasures. One incident from this period stands out for its sheer callousness. Shortly after returning to Staffordshire, Palmer met a man named George Abley in a pub in the village of Little Haywood. Palmer challenged him to a drinking contest. Abley accepted. Within an hour, Abley had to be carried home. He died in his bed that same evening. Palmer had been paying attention to Abley's attractive wife, which naturally raised suspicions. But no evidence of foul play was found, and the matter was quietly dropped. Palmer did eventually open a medical practice, but his name appeared in the London and Provincial Medical Directory for 1851 and 1855 with a notable omission. He was listed among those practitioners who had not bothered to inform the editor of the nature of their qualifications. His real interests lay elsewhere. Cards, horses, women, and increasingly the racetrack, where fortunes could be won or lost in an afternoon. Palmer was not a successful gambler. The debts began to mount. On October 7, 1847, Palmer married 20-year-old Anne Thornton. She was illegitimate, but that hardly mattered. What mattered was her inheritance. Anne's mother, Mary Thornton, had worked as a housekeeper for Colonel William Brooke, a retired officer who had served in British India. Before his suicide in 1834, the colonel had written a will, leaving substantial property to his illegitimate daughter, Anne. 9 houses in Stafford, land, an annual income of 20,000 Sikha rupees from his Indian investments. There were trustees, of course, legal complications, Anne could access some income from the property, but she could not dispose of it freely. And her mother Mary still controlled part of the estate, which would only pass to Anne upon her death. Mary Thornton was the obstacle standing between Palmer and his wife's full inheritance. On January 18, 1849, Mary came to stay at the Palmer household in Rugeley. She died there that same day. The cause of death was recorded as apoplectic stroke. No questions were asked. No investigation opened. But even with his mother-in-law dead, the inheritance remained frustratingly out of reach. Legal technicalities in Colonel Brooks' will meant that Anne could only receive modest interest payments. She could not touch the capital. Palmer had killed for money, and he had barely gotten any. His debts continued to grow. Palmer's passion for horse racing was becoming an expensive obsession. In early 1850, he borrowed £600 from a man named Leonard Bladen. In today's terms, that would be roughly £86,000. It was not a casual loan between friends. It was serious money. Bladen and Palmer moved in the same racing circles. They knew each other well enough for Bladen to trust Palmer with such a sum. On May 10, 1850, Leonard Bladen died suddenly. Palmer's wife Anne was surprised to learn that Bladen had died with very little money to his name. This seemed strange because he had recently won a considerable sum at the races. Even more peculiar, Bladen's account books had vanished. There was no record of any debt owed by Palmer. The death certificate listed the cause as injury to the hip joint, 5 and 6 months, abscess in the pelvic region. William Palmer was listed as having been present at the death. No investigation followed. No questions were raised. The pattern was becoming clearer. When Palmer needed money, people around him had a habit of dying at convenient moments. And because he was a physician, because he could sign death certificates and speak the language of medicine, his word was rarely challenged. But the debts kept mounting, and Palmer's solution was always the same. Someone else would have to die. Between 1848 and 1854, Anne and William Palmer welcomed 5 children into their family. In the harsh reality of mid-19th century England, only one would reach maturity. Their firstborn, William Brooke Palmer, was born in late 1848. He would outlive his father, eventually passing away in 1926. However, the subsequent 4 lives were tragically brief. The second addition to the family remained for 10 weeks, the third for about a month, the fourth for only a few hours, the fifth for just a few days. To a modern audience, this is incomprehensible, but in 1850, the cradle was often shadowed by the grave. The Industrial Revolution had brought overcrowding and poor sanitation. Nearly 1 in 4 children did not see their 5th birthday. In such a climate, these frequent family tragedies were often accepted as a sorrowful part of life. But even by these grim historical standards, the sequence of events in the Palmer household was striking. The timeline of these losses seemed to accelerate with each subsequent birth. No formal inquiry was ever conducted. At the time, such instances were recorded as part of a common and tragic statistic. And as a physician, Palmer's own certificates were rarely questioned. Yet, years later, the shadow of these early losses would heavily color the public's perception of the man. By 1854, Palmer's financial situation had become desperate, Years of gambling on cards and horses had buried him in debt. The modest income from his wife's property was nowhere near enough to cover his losses. He needed a new solution, and this time he thought bigger. In January 1854, Palmer took out a life insurance policy on his wife through Norwich Union, one of Britain's largest and most established insurance companies. The policy was worth £3,000. In today's money, approximately £354,000. But Palmer wasn't finished. In March of that same year, he insured Anne's life again, this time with the Sun Insurance Company, for £5,000. That would be roughly £590,000 today. And then a third policy with Scottish Equitable, another £5,000. In total, Palmer had insured his wife's life for £13,000, the equivalent of over £1.5 million in modern currency. It was an extraordinary sum, far more than most working-class families would see in a lifetime, more than enough to settle his debts and continue his lifestyle for years. All that stood between William Palmer and financial freedom was his 27-year-old wife. On September 29, 1854, Anne Palmer died. The cause of death was recorded as cholera. The timing could not have been more perfect. Britain was in the grip of a devastating cholera epidemic that would last from 1846 to 1860, claiming at least 23,000 lives across the country. Deaths were common. Few questions were asked. Anne Palmer's death fit the pattern perfectly. A cholera diagnosis raised no suspicion. On October 16, 1854, the grieving widower filed claims through his solicitor, Mr. Pratt. The insurance companies, finding no reason to doubt the claim, paid out. Norwich Union and the Sun together paid £8,000. Scottish Equitable paid £5,000. In total, £13,000. Nearly £1.5 million in today's currency. It was a fortune. Enough to clear his debts, restart his life, live comfortably for years. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. By the time the money arrived in February 1855, Palmer's gambling debts had grown so massive that the entire insurance payout barely made a dent. He owed nearly £23,000 to various creditors, more than £2.7 million in modern terms. The insurance money was gone almost as soon as it arrived. Palmer was right back where he started, drowning in debt, desperate for cash. And he had learned something important. Life insurance paid well, and cholera made an excellent cover story. He just needed another victim. Palmer's desperation drove him to an audacious plan. He would insure his brother Walter's life for £84,000. In modern currency, nearly £10 million. It was an absurd sum. No insurance company would agree to such a policy, and Palmer knew it. But he tried anyway, shopping the proposal around to various insurers. Eventually, he found a company willing to offer a smaller policy, £14,000. Still substantial, but far less than he had hoped for. Walter Palmer was a heavy drinker, which made him the perfect target. William began plying his brother with alcohol, encouraging his worst habits, accelerating his decline. On August 16, 1855, Walter died. But this time, something went wrong. The insurance company refused to pay. Instead, they launched an internal investigation. During their inquiry, they discovered something alarming. Palmer had also attempted to insure the life of George Bate, a farmer who worked for him briefly. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Yet, incredibly, the insurance company did not contact Scotland Yard or the local police. They simply confirmed their refusal to pay and recommended Palmer provide additional evidence of death. He never did. But Palmer had tasted easy money, and he couldn't stop now. He had already chosen his next victim. This time, it would be a friend. William Palmer was friendly with a young man named John Cook. They shared a passion for horse racing and spent considerable time together at the tracks. On November 13, 1855, Cook's horse, Polestar, won a race in Shrewsbury, Shropshire. The prize money was £3,000, a small fortune. That evening, Cook hosted a celebratory dinner. Palmer was among the guests. The Illustrated Times later reported what happened. Having fully enjoyed the foreign wines, the owner of Polestar resorted to brandy and water to restore his British stamina. Throwing down his glass, he complained that something had burned his throat. That night, he was very, very ill. What's remarkable is that Cook immediately suspected the cause. The next day, he gave a portion of his winnings to a friend, Ishmael Fisher, for safekeeping, expressing his conviction that Palmer had poisoned him for his money. Yet, incredibly, Cook did not end his friendship with Palmer. They returned to Rugeley together, seemingly as close as ever. Cook continued to display symptoms of illness. Palmer, ever the attentive physician, took care of his suffering friend. For the next several days, Cook's condition worsened. He was in agony, and Palmer continued to treat him. On November 20th, Palmer visited a pharmacy and purchased strychnine. Strychnine is an exceptionally potent poison derived from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree. In large doses, it causes horrific convulsions, triggering excruciatingly painful reactions throughout the body before leading to death. John Cook's final days were an ordeal of unimaginable suffering. The convulsions grew worse with each passing hour. An elderly physician, 82-year-old Dr. Bamford, prescribed opium pills to ease the seizures. The pills never reached Cook. Palmer intercepted them. Cook continued to writhe in terrible spasms, his body contorting in ways that defied nature. On November 21st, 1855, he died in agony. Palmer immediately pressured Dr. Bamford to record the cause of death as apoplectic stroke, the same diagnosis he had used for his mother-in-law years earlier. But Cook's friends were suspicious. They insisted on a post-mortem examination. Cook's stomach contents were removed and sent for analysis. Palmer grew desperate. He attempted to steal the jar containing Cook's stomach contents before it could be examined. He failed. The jar was sent to London, to the hospital at Guy's, where Britain's foremost toxicologist would conduct the analysis. Finally, the net was closing around William Palmer. The respectable physician, the educated gentleman, the man who had killed with impunity for years, had made a fatal mistake. He had murdered someone whose friends refused to look away. Palmer was arrested. The man who would examine John Cook's remains was Alfred Swain Taylor, the father of British toxicology. Born in 1806, Taylor had literally written the book on poisons. His Treatise on Poisons in Relation to Medical Jurisprudence, Physiology, and Medical Practice was published in London in 1844 and had become the standard reference work in the field. By 1855, Taylor was at the height of his fame. When Cook's stomach contents arrived at Guy's Hospital in London, founded in 1721, Taylor began his analysis. The results were frustrating. Despite his expertise, despite the sophisticated laboratory at his disposal, Taylor could not detect strychnine in the samples. The chemical tests available at the time were simply not sensitive enough to identify the poison with certainty. But Taylor was not defeated. He turned instead to the clinical evidence, the descriptions of Cook's final hours, the violent convulsions, the contorted body, the agonizing spasms. Based on these symptoms, Taylor reached a conclusion. There were only two possible explanations. Either Cook had suffered from severe tetanus, or he had been poisoned with strychnine. Palmer claimed he had not poisoned Cook, but the evidence was mounting, and there were other bodies to examine. The case was moving toward trial. Authorities ordered exhumations. The bodies of Palmer's wife Anne and his brother Walter were removed from their graves. Walter's body had decomposed significantly, making analysis difficult. But Anne's remains told a different story. Dr. Taylor discovered antimony present in all of her organs. This was clear evidence of poisoning. Palmer had no defense left. The pattern was undeniable. His mother-in-law, Leonard Bladen, his 4 infant children, his wife, his brother, John Cook, all had died under suspicious circumstances, all when their deaths benefited Palmer financially. The trial was scheduled for May 18, 1956, at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court. It was moved there by special Act of Parliament. The concern was that jurors in Staffordshire might be too prejudiced by the sensational coverage in the local press. The newspapers had whipped themselves into a frenzy. They accused Palmer of everything imaginable. One paper even claimed he had named one of his racehorses Strychnine, though this was completely fabricated. More dangerously, rumors circulated regarding the unexplained losses of his infant children. No evidence was ever presented to support these suspicions, but the damage was done. Public opinion had already convicted him. Some believed the trial was moved to London to ensure fairness. Others, including Lord Chief Justice John Campbell, suggested the opposite. He believed that if the trial had remained in Stafford, Palmer might actually have been acquitted. The trial began on May 12, 1856, and lasted 12 days, concluding on May 27th. It was a sensation unlike anything Victorian Britain had witnessed before. The courtroom at the Old Bailey was packed. Outside, enormous crowds gathered daily, hoping for a glimpse of the infamous poisoner. The press covered every moment of the proceedings, printing transcripts and commentary that were devoured by a public hungry for details. Inside the courtroom, the evidence mounted steadily against Palmer. Witness after witness described Cook's final agonizing hours. The convulsions, the screaming, the unnatural way his body contorted. Dr. Taylor presented his findings. The antimony in Anne Palmer's body, the clinical symptoms consistent with strychnine poisoning, the pattern of deaths surrounding William Palmer wherever he went. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had turned medicine into murder, a physician who used his knowledge not to heal, but to kill, a calculating predator who saw those around him not as human beings, but as financial opportunities. Palmer's defense attempted to raise doubts. They questioned whether strychnine had truly been the cause of death when it could not be definitively detected. They suggested alternative explanations for the symptoms. But the weight of circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The life insurance policies, the convenient deaths, the pattern spanning years. The jury deliberated for just under an hour. Guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. On the morning of June 14, 1856, William Palmer was led from Stafford Jail to the gallows that had been erected outside. 30,000 people had gathered to watch. They came from across the county, filling every available space, pressing against barriers, climbing onto rooftops and walls. Palmer walked calmly to the scaffold, dressed respectably, maintaining his composure to the very end. As the executioner prepared the noose, Palmer looked up at the wooden structure and asked his final question. "Are you sure it's safe?" Even facing death, he could not resist a darkly ironic joke. At 8 o'clock in the morning, William Palmer was hanged. The crowd watched in near silence as the trapdoor opened and he dropped. The doctor who had sworn an oath to preserve life had instead become one of Victorian England's most prolific killers. His education at Britain's finest medical institutions had given him the knowledge to heal. Instead, he used that knowledge to murder. Palmer killed for money, for debts, for convenience. He killed his mother-in-law, his wife, potentially the youngest members of his own family, his brother, his friends, his creditors. He turned poison into profit and medicine into murder. His case would change British law forever, leading to reforms in life insurance and toxicology. But it could not bring back his victims.